So hi, and welcome to the Far Right Transnational Connections panel. My name is Girish Daswani. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a settler living in Toronto, home to many indigenous peoples, including the Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and it's also a part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. I'm an associate professor of anthropology here at the University of Toronto, and one of the co-organizers of the panel, along with Mackenzie Graham. The panel is also hosted by the blogs Human Stories and Everyday Orientalism. Before passing the mic over to our chair, Cherian George, it would be a remiss of me not to mention that here in Canada, we have for the past 10 days been dealing with white supremacist settler violence in the form of the Freedom Convoy, which is largely consisting of a group of truckers and anti-vaxxers, many of whom have expressed racist, misogynist, anti-Semitic, anti-healthcare, and anti-LGBTQ views. We have seen them fly Nazi, pro-Trump, and Confederate flags. We have seen them assault people and desecrate national symbols, all while claiming to fight for freedom. We've also seen many political leaders pander to them and their needs. So this is a very momentous time, I think. And I mean, the timing is very important in bringing this conversation to a wider audience and to make the connections beyond Canada as well. So let me move on quickly by introducing our distinguished chair. Cherian George is a professor of media studies at Hong Kong Baptist University School for Communication and Film, where he also serves as Associate Dean for Research. He researches media freedom, censorship, and hate propaganda. His books include Hate Spin, The Manufacture of a Religious Offense and Its Threat to Democracy. And this came out in 2016 with MIT Press. He received his PhD in communication from Stanford University. Before joining academia, he was also a journalist with the main newspaper in Singapore called the Straits Times. And I'm going to now pass the mic over to Cherian, who will chair the rest of the session. I'll see you later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Girish. It's a great pleasure and honor to be the conductor for this conversation that we're going to have in the coming couple of hours. Thank you to you and Mac of Human Stories and Catherine of Everyday Orientalism for putting together this session. It's my huge privilege to chair a session with with four distinguished, extremely interesting scholars who approach our topic with shared concern, but really from very different traditions, scholarly traditions, as well as geographic interests. The topic that we are discussing today, far-right transnational connections, is something that I think is felt intensely at the local level. It's taken personally. It is taken, it's something that that we think of as uniquely oppressive in our own situations, and that ironically often makes us blind to just how global and interconnected a phenomenon it actually is. And I think that's a key purpose of the session that we're going to have, to see what connections there are between these groups, but also what kind of conceptual links we can form, what lessons we can draw from experiences far away from ours. I'm going to introduce the speakers just before they speak. We'll open with, say, 5 minutes of introductory remarks before we go into a more fluid Q&A. And we've decided to work geographically in concentric circles out of where I guess most of the audience and the organizers are in Canada. And we're going to start with Melody De Vries, who is a PhD candidate in the Communication and Culture Department at Ryerson University, Toronto. Melody uses digital ethnographic methods to examine how far-right and conspiratorial politics spread, including how the Christian right helps to mainstream far-right politics. Melody?
Yes, thanks very much for that introduction. And hello to everyone that's made it to the panel today. And so, yeah, for the past couple of years, I've been doing kind of online, mostly ethnographic research. And my goal has really been to trace everyday digital practices and interactions that people have with far-right content in order to get a better understanding of how these actual everyday mundane practices contribute over time to how people might be recruited into or convinced or compelled by far-right or conspiratorial concepts. And so I'm really honored to be speaking alongside these other scholars about what is clearly an issue of ongoing concern. And in terms of ongoing concern, last year I actually put together a talk called, is called Trump's Gone, Now What? And my point in the talk was that essentially, while the kind of outlandish and horrific expressions of American far-right politics by President Trump and the alt-right gathered a lot of attention from journalists and far-right scholars, since 2015. Today in 2022, it's really critical for scholars to draw attention towards as well the non-explicit ways that everyday supremacist culture continues to produce new instantiations of the far right. Because while it might sometimes seem that, explicitly far-right politics might be experiencing a lull, given the election of Joe Biden in the US, or, the continuous leadership shuffling and identity crisis happening in the Conservative Party in Canada for those of us here. At the same time, what we're actually seeing today is, I think, a different but also entirely familiar surge of contemporary far-right politics that are finding fuel within more mainstream spaces. So in other words, what I've found is not only that far-right actors and online content creators have gotten much better at keeping their politics hidden when trying to recruit others, but also that far-right politics and their contemporary manifestations are not really something that we can really entirely classify as fringe or as something disconnected from mainstream politics or various institutions that write systems of power, which obviously transcend national borders and deeply shape what types of political rhetoric is palatable for the majority of folks out there. And so obviously the most explicit expression of this right now is, as Girish mentioned, the Truckers' Freedom Convoy that has made its way into downtown Toronto this weekend. And it's proposing to be just, about COVID mandates, but it's really this kind of expression of far-right groups, and it was organized and has been supported by explicitly white supremacist and conspiratorial actors. And so actually in the spirit of ethnographic investigation, on Saturday, I actually walked through much of the convoy, which was actually really just a giant unsanctioned block party, as opposed to a coherent protest with a list of demands and whatnot. And really what struck me most, aside from the actual size of the group, was the extent to which, families with young kids, and I suppose what we could call everyday folks, holding signs that simply read freedom or something vague like that, were mobilized alongside people that had much more extreme signs or that peddled conspiracies about, the globalists and vaccines and that type of thing. So what we're continuing to learn, I think, from events like this is that, at least in Canada and the US, is that the contemporary far right is no longer really something that is entirely fringe or contained within recognizable hate groups. Instead, it's something that bleeds into and finds comfortable home within many folks who really care more about attending block parties or social events in the name of the concept of Canadian freedom, in this case, which of course is the freedom to consume and purchase goods, as opposed to any coherently articulated political ideology. And this is actually what I think really makes the contemporary far right of 2022 so dangerous. The fact that otherwise non-politically involved folks can be mobilized to support its ends given what forces are already present in mainstream culture. And of course, we're also still just finding out more about the American politicians and funding and organizing that has come over the border to shape the convoy protests and provide big funding for these ideas and their expressions in Canada. So I'm very much looking forward to getting more into all of this and hearing more transnational contexts from the other panelists as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Melody. I've already got so many questions for you, but those were very interesting remarks. And I think it reminds me, you know, as someone who identifies as a hate scholar and looks at hate speech, that, you know, in fact, that in a way it only scratches the surface, right? Because I like this term that some scholars use, discriminatory discourses, which gets at the kind of sort of normalized discourse that is often not shocking and you know, doesn't raise red flags, but in fact could in fact be much more insidious over the long term. Let's turn next to Anima Ajipong, who is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Cincinnati. Anima is especially interested in how cultural struggles can bring about social transformation. I'd highly recommend Anima's latest book, Afropolitan Projects, that I dipped into. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but extremely interesting ideas about the African diaspora. Anima, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hirian, and good morning, everyone. So I want to structure my opening remarks by saying a little bit about my research, which is firmly located in Ghana, and using that case as a way of thinking through what really kind of becomes visible when we not only stretch the timeline that we're looking at, but also pay attention to the everyday, which is very similar to what Melody was saying. I think in that context, we really begin to see those connections as they appear on a quotidian level. So I'm a sociologist by training, and I spent the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years looking at the everyday cultural practices of class privileged Ghanaians who are positioning themselves as Africans of the world, citizens of the world. And in that process, one of the things that I really came to understand was hegemony. Now, this might sound maybe a bit surprising, but because we're always constantly kind of embroiled in these hegemonic discourses and that sort of thing. But in the course of my research, one of the things that really became apparent to me was how a culture of silence was reproducing these anti-queer positionalities within different Ghanaian cultural spaces, even as in more intimate settings, there was a challenge and a pushback. And so that raised the question for me of how did that persist so much? It's not really, but one of the things we understand is that wherever there is an oppressive kind of discourse or material reality, there's resistance, and that resistance shows up. But what I was finding in my work was that the resistance was really muted in a lot of different ways, and it raised the question for me of how that could be possible. And so actually just last year, the an LGBTQ center was opened in Ghana. It was the first of its kind to be named an LGBTQ center. So they've been community centers, but this one was like, we're gonna name queerness in the opening of the center. And shortly after that, the police raided the center. It was shut down. People ran away for fear of their lives, and there was this kind of heightened terrorism. And so I brought a group of people together to draft a solidarity statement, and we solicited signatures. And since that time, there has been some increased resistance to an anti-queer climate that's in Ghana. And so I just want you to hold on to that for a little bit. I'll come back to it. because part of what I want to do with this contextualization is to know that I'm not a far right scholar. I'm not a scholar um, of far right activism or that sort of thing. I'm a transnational scholar, and necessarily in entering this space, I've had to confront how there are these intricate connections between what we're understanding is happening on a local level. And in Ghana, it's the push to get everyone an ID card. It's called the Ghana card. It's an e-levy that's a tax that's being put on ordinary citizens. It's a debate around whether or not queer people are Ghanaians and what's to be done with them. And all of these things look very local when you're in that context. And yet, once you start to kind of trace the precedences of these discussions, you see the transnational connections that are making them happen. So now I'll go back to the bill that has been presented in Ghana's parliament. That bill was presented in the late summer, in the late summer, probably early summer in June or so. Now the bill is something that was championed by an organization that began around 2011, calling itself the Coalition for Proper Human Rights and Sexual Values, or something, and Ghanaian Sexual Values. But the writers of the bill are not an exclusively Ghanaian collective, right? They are connected with far-right activists here in the US, who are connected with folks in Poland, who are connected with folks in Russia, who are connected with folks in Uganda, etc. And once you see that, you also begin to see how the language reproduces itself in the kind of things that they're trying to get affected. Now, it didn't take long for me to see that language that shows up in section 104, section 90, whatever it is in the British Penal Code. And so that's one of the moments in which I think it becomes really important to expand the timeline, which is to say, maybe we don't talk about colonialism as a far right movement, but when we think about these resonances, we begin to see how that continues to happen in the present moment as well, in this post-colonial moment that we're living in. And there's much more to say there, but I'm just trying to kind of set the groundwork. So I'll say one more thing, which is around the cooptation of decolonialism as a way of advancing these kind of far right notions. So once again, in the Ghanaian case, the notion of Ghanaian cultural values has really been used to advance these. And I don't want to suggest that anti-queer positionalities are external. They are very much internal, but they're also the product of transnational solidarities, not the kinds that I thought I was initially interested in, but really kind of my work helped me see that this isn't just it's not just like a progressive left that's doing transnational work, but there's also a very radical right that's doing the same kind of thing. And within the Ghanaian context, the notion of decolonialism is used as an avenue for instantiating these kind of hateful this kind of hateful bill, so that while queer activists perhaps on the one hand are saying we are trying to decolonize the Constitution, which other people are doing as well, and I can talk more about that later, the parliament, which is this neo-colonial entity, is also claiming a decolonial mandate by setting up this bill. And on both sides, there are these transnational solidarities at play. But of course, the reality is that the right has better mechanisms to affect this kind of work. So I will stop here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Anima. Again, so much to pick up on. I'll just highlight a couple of things that struck me just off the bat. One, of course, is that in a week when the world is celebrating the jubilee of in the UK, 70 years since the ascension of Queen Elizabeth. I think it's you've provided a useful reminder that transnational connections aren't just current, but have a deep history, and the legacy of all these extremely problematic colonial legislation is one of the less salutary legacies of colonial rule, which affects my own country in Singapore and my neighbors in Malaysia and India and so on as well. Let's move on next to, we're going by distance from Toronto, so I believe it's Copenhagen. Ravinder Kaur, who is Associate Professor of Modern South Asian Studies at the University of Copenhagen. As a historian, she studies capitalist transformations in 21st century India. She's the author of a great book that came out a couple of years ago, Brand New Nation, Capitalist Dreams and Nationalist Designs in 21st century India. Ravinder.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. And very quickly, I would say that I have two main points that I would like to make. First, that to make sense of the transnational connections, we need to make sense of how the national context itself is transforming. And what kind of transnationalism then is emerging, which I believe is quite different from the one initially theorized at the turn of the 21st century. And the second is what precisely constitutes the notion of far right, and what is it afar from, and where is the center that is the negotiated consensus which it is diverging from. I'm asking these questions because the parameters of temporal distance are embedded in the proposed topic or the proposed political ideological shifts we are talking about. That is, how long before we reach that far from where we stand now in the political spectrum. So to be sure, to take a right turn in this discourse suggests moving towards a form of hyper-nationalism that lives off ideas of authenticity, purity, and exclusive claims to belong to, or to speak for the faith community or the nation. It means effacing all that doesn't fit the frame of authentic cultural difference. So to be far out on this spectrum means violent expulsions, a recurring phenomena to purge those deemed foreign or the undesired in the community. If this is what it means to be far right, then we need to take a fresh look, perhaps the vision of the world, which perhaps is not that far off. And perhaps the center that we have long taken granted for has already moved in a new direction that we imagined as the far right. The point being, are we already there? So let me explain this with an example from post-colonial India, where my work is grounded. Many of you may have heard of the phrase called idea of India that has long been a popular currency, a familiar shorthand to explain what New India carved in 1947 stood for. A thriving democracy, a secular multicultural assemblage framed along desires and infrastructures of techno-modernity. This India is often pictured with a sense of wonder, of having defied the odds and overcome internal pressures and external conflicts to emerge as an economic powerhouse, the one half of the India-China Asian giants duo in the early 21st century. The past few years, this idea of India has come to be contested, as you may be aware of, even turned into a fractious battleground. The news headlines in Indian papers often report terms like love jihad, beef ban, or the ongoing controversy over headscarves in a college. I'm naming all these terms, and if somebody is unclear, I can explain them further. Basically, what I'm getting at is, how did it come to this? How did the idea of India become a battleground? And the answer I propose is counterintuitive. First, the unfolding right turn or the 21st century hyper-nationalism is not a counterforce against the free market globalization, which is often held out to be in popular discourses. It emerges from phenomena of the nation state transforming itself into an enclosure for capital, all in the shadow of transnational market connections, or what we call globalization. The lifeblood of this new nation, the dream worlds of capitalist growth stories, and in the case of India, a majoritarian quest to recover a mythical Hindu golden past. Second, the right turn is enacted in a transnational space that demarcates the domestic affairs as a forbidden territory for external actors. This is very different from the transnationalism that we are used to of thinking in terms of. So the tacit bargain in this transnational space is that the state, nation state, manages and facilitates capital mobility and in return retains the power to rearrange the domestic sphere without external interference or sanction. So the world we are witnessing is made up of many nations, and this is where we need to rethink, as the very idea of nation state is reinforced. The capitalist logic that frames the contemporary world then extends beyond selling the nation to investors. It has not only furthered the Hindu nationalist agenda to create a unified cultural identity, it has also rearranged the social political landscape. Critical to this transformation is how brand India, as it is known, is it opens up a fractious politics of visual re-territorialization of the nation. Who are the chosen people who inhabit the visual surface of the nation brand? Which cultural practices and ideas are left out of the frame, concealed from the eyes of the world? Who owns the nation and its natural and cultural possessions, and who has the power or right to capitalize these possessions? If the visual frame of the nation brand is a form of public recognition of the nation's cultural essence, then that unique difference acquires legitimacy precisely by being chosen for illumination by the state. It is here that all the massive publicity that has accompanied the making of brand India assumes significance. The predominant choice of pre-Muslim Hindu cultural practices in the image frame, which eventually become the cultural mainframe of the nation. The very act of illumination of cultural Hinduism as symbolic of modern India marginalizes all other religious groups and multicultural identities of post-colonial India. Witness how the idea of India and Hindu is increasingly conflated in public imagination. So to put simply, the secular and egalitarian roots of the old anti-colonial nationalism are giving way to unabashed Hindu nationalism that neither brooks dissent nor is willing to share power with the minority groups. So it is this national frame that I wanted to put forth, and then to pose the question, then what precisely is the transnational framework that we are speaking about? The connections between the Hindu far, which I'm again saying, it's not that far, it's already here probably. Those connections are very well established. I'm just laying out a few points. I'll be very happy to discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravinder. Next, let's go to Athens, Greece, where Rebecca Futuro Kennedy is waiting for us. Rebecca is an associate professor of classical studies at Denison University. She's currently completing a book on race and ethnicity in the ancient world and its modern politics, as well as a short historiography on how the ancient Greeks and Romans came to be racialized as white in the 19th and 20th centuries. Her blog, Classics at the Intersections, is something I can recommend. It can be found at rfkclassics.blogspot.com. Rebecca.
I just did the Zoom thing where it's like, oh, sorry, I'm still muted. So I'm coming here from Athens today, though I live in the United States typically. One of the things that I think is that I wanted to sort of highlight for me, thinking about transnational far-right movements is actually literally transnational, and things are moving back and forth between the United States and Greece back to the United States, and how a lot of my work focuses on how the ancient Greek world and sort of ancient Greek and Roman things are used, history, iconography, literature, et cetera, are used in the formation of modern US politics and identities. But things are, real on the ground here in Greece too, where that ancient Greek culture is a continually contested space of legitimacy for the identity of the modern Greek nation. And there is actually quite an interesting uniformity between the types of movements that we see, and instead of calling them far-right movements, I will call them what they are. They are neo-Nazi and Nazi revival movements that are moving back and forth between the US and Greece. There's a uniformity of the type of iconography they're using. There's a uniformity of the type of ideologies that they're drawing on, and they are in fact all dipping from the well of the Nazis almost straight up. So that's something that I wanted to sort of highlight to start off with, and maybe I'll just give a little bit of detail. When I think that Ravinda's point about what's far right and is it already here in the United States especially, and in Greece are both issues to be considered, because what we consider the far right in the United States has always been there. It's been there since the 19th century. And it just continually is moving in and out of visibility as opposed to in and out of the center. The sort of dominant white supremacist culture that these current groups like the Proud Boys, Vanguard America, which split off actually after the 2017 Charlottesville rally into National Vanguard and Patriot Front and a couple of other groups. There's another group called Identity Evropa that recently recoined itself as the American Identitarian Movement. They all are actually dipping from the well of early 20th century eugenics movements and the sort of white supremacist, white crisis organizations and authors that were actually feeding Hitler, including Madison Grant with his book, Passing of the Great Race, and people like Lothrop Stoddard and others. Those ideas are being revived. Ideas that, like, race mixture destroyed the Roman Empire, are sort of a backbone of many of their fears and their movement that they embrace right now. And in Greece, of course, Golden Dawn was the biggest far-right group. It had set up shop here in Athens in some of the poorer districts and then sort of fanned out. In 2020, their leadership, the group was banned and the leadership was sent to prison for all sorts of racketeering and criminal enterprises. But they left a vacuum, and also going on in 2018 was an ongoing 2018 finally settled an ongoing dispute with the Republic of Macedon that was going through the EU about the naming of the use of the name Macedon or Macedonia as something that was legitimately okay for a non-Greek nation. And this is actually a fight over who owned this ancient past of Alexander the Great and his father Philip and that sort of glory of ancient Macedonia. And so now in the hole that Golden Dawn has left, we're seeing since last year a rise in extremist neo-Nazi groups in Thessaloniki and northern Greece that are piggybacking off of the agreement to allow the Republic of Macedonia to use the name, and this fight over who really are the real Greeks. In Athens, the mayor a few years ago put up a statue of Alexander the Great, claiming, Macedon is Greece. Well, the ancient Athenians, of course, the idea of putting up a statue of Alexander in the city would have been appalling because he was a conqueror, not welcome. But this politics of antiquity is constantly being used to inform the way these groups are forming their modern identities. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of, I don't think, coincidental overlap of iconography that they're using in their flags, in their slogans. And I think, as Melody pointed out, some of the sloganeering and things that are happening in the Convoy are all things that are coming out of, a lot of them are coming out of US-centric groups. But interestingly enough as well, one of the major impetuses behind the increase in these extremist neo-Nazi groups in northern Greece is Pontic Greeks who are immigrating or who have immigrated back to Greece from Russia. And so there's also this sort of underlying role of Russia in sort of a lot of these far-right identitarian movements that are arising in Europe and in the United States, and I think also in Canada. So I'll go ahead and sort of leave it at, oh, I should probably mention one other thing. Another backbone of a lot of these neo-Nazi and far-right groups is the Second Amendment rights movement in the US. And this may explain why, if you look at pictures from Canada, you're not seeing Spartan iconography, which tends to dominate these far-right Second Amendment groups, because of course gun culture is very different, and this is where we see another US-Russia connection. But you'll see flags all over the place with Molon Labe, a phrase that the Spartans never said that translates loosely as "come and take it," which is used as a sort of underpinning of this Second Amendment rights movement, which is a sort of backbone of the neo-Nazi movements in the United States. The Oath Keepers are sort of one of the primary proponents of that, and the Oath Keepers are currently on their leadership is on trial at the in the US for conspiratorial sedition, for actually being one of the major organizers of the January 6th attacks on the US Capitol. So there's a lot of this intertwining, and part of what I try to do is to try to disentangle and understand these connections and how they're all using each other and feeding off of each other, and how they all go back to these early sort of what we call white crisis movements, great replacement theory movements that go back into the early part of the 20th century, and that preceded and fed the Nazi movement, and then of course are feeding its revivals now. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I especially enjoyed hearing you mention the Macedonian name dispute, because my own PhD student happens to be researching it for his dissertation, something I'd never heard of before, and I still can't get my mind around it, because I think what's remarkable is that unlike other territorial disputes that are over physical territory, in this case, there's no real dispute over where the border is. They're just arguing over the name, and you know, it's a great bad example of how well, I guess the left or the right in any part of the world is able to fabricate you know, causes for indignation, right? The injustice symbols over practically anything or nothing, right? Out of thin air, practically.
But I think it's also it's a great symbol of how we use how different groups use the past to repackage their present identities.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. I mean, the past is like an endless, you know, wellspring of reasons to get worked up, right? As of course those who study India know very well, like Ravinder. I'm going to move to, I've got loads of questions, like I said. I'll try not to hog the time, because I'm sure the audience has questions too. A reminder to the audience that if you do have questions, now's about the time you should be trying to formulate them and type them into the Q&A box. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. But I have the privilege of asking the first round, and I'm going to start by putting a question to Melody and Anima. I'm going to, you know, one of the things that I find extremely refreshing about this panel, mind-blowingly novel, is the fact that none of you has mentioned the internet or social media. And I found this liberating, right? Because you know, in almost every discussion of the far right and hate and intolerance, right? People just cannot stop talking about the internet. And it's just so refreshing that all four of you see beyond it, right? And I want to ask Melody and Anima that, you know, you both study the everyday. And I'm sure part of that everyday exists online, but equally, I'm sure you recognize that the everyday exists in the real world and not just in social networks and so on. So I'd like to invite you to expand on why it is so important in your minds to study the everyday when trying to understand movements. Melody, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for asking that question. It kind of builds off of what I started my opening statement with just in the fact that since Trump and the so-called rise of the alt-right, yes, there's been so much emphasis on the internet and these like extreme spaces that are just horrible. And there's also been a lot of discourse in far-right studies that kind of attributes most of the normalizing of far-right concepts to these particular groups, say on 4chan or Reddit. And obviously it is the case that there are these kind of like fringe online communities that exist and have some play in cultural rhetoric. But really, to me, I think that we can understand this kind of latching onto the concept of these like specific online groups as an extension of how far-right studies kind of typically used to treat, or it still does a lot of the time, treat far-right formations as, compact militias or hate groups like the KKK. And what that's doing is conceptualizing the far-right as something that can be conceived as outside of a network, and that exists on the fringe, and that of course is not like us democratic citizens, but that is this other element of society that has gone wrong. But of course, what we're seeing more and more, or at least what we're drawing our attention to, is the fact that far-right manifestations or supremacist manifestations have always been thoroughly embedded in mainstream culture. And in terms of why everyday practices are therefore so important, there's kind of two reasons there that I would address. Number one being that I think that everyday practices are what convinces people. The more that we habitually do something, the more that we kind of identify with those concepts, or the more that we become affiliated with the kind of political ideology or identity that matches the practices that we do. An example of that would be in the chapter that I published recently in my edited volume, Rise of the Far Right, Technologies of Recruitment and Mobilization. I talk about how ongoing practices and involvement with online communities can, over time, kind of solidify the ideas that you're participating with, more so than the content being convincing itself. So I think there's going to be this shift towards paying attention to how practices actually work to solidify your beliefs, as opposed to content itself being the convincing element. But of course, we still have a lot of study that focuses on what is in online content and kind of uses that as a proxy to understand recruitment. So that's why I kind of study everyday practices. I look at how those practices slowly pull people towards being okay with more far-right ideas. But of course, everyday practices are also connected to histories of institutional normalization of far-right ideas, and everyday practices kind of mark what we are comfortable with, and of course those come from oppressive histories. And one of the things that is coming up in my mind is a recent study about TikTok and their algorithm, and essentially transphobic, extremely violent videos on TikTok. A study was done, and essentially within 2 hours of watching transphobic videos, the algorithm will suggest explicitly white supremacist content, like suggesting the 14 words and stuff like that. And I was asked to comment on this piece, and it got me thinking about how it's not necessarily that transphobic content is far right that made that connection there, but the fact that transphobic content is normal, unfortunately. It is the case that transphobic content can pull just anyone in, because unfortunately transphobia is so deeply entrenched in our still male supremacist and heteronormative culture. But then at the same time, because those are supremacist concepts, those are still allowing linkages to happen between what we would call more explicit far-right ideas. And so I could keep going about other examples of how the mainstream is never really actually separate from the far-right, but I'll pass it off in a moment. But what I've also been recently studying is the extent to which the the evangelical far right or the Christian right in the United States has been pushing for a long time to have these kind of heteronormative and male supremacist concepts. They've been pushing to maintain that normalcy, and that is continuing to shape mainstream expressions of the right, to the extent that I think it would be useful for scholars nowadays to use the term mainstream far right, kind of reflecting Ravinder's points a little bit. So I'll stop there, but yeah, there'll be lots more to talk about in terms of that concept and the importance of understanding everyday life, everyday practice, everyday values in maintaining the dominance of far right ideas. And I'll post a link as well to that.
Great. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Anima?
Yeah, those were some really interesting connections that Melody drew. As I appreciate the question as well, and I think there are two main things that I want to say in my response to why it's not enough to study the internet and the importance of studying the everyday. One of the first things is that to my mind, the material reality of the everyday is so much messier than anything you can come across online. And in that space, you see the paradoxical positions that individuals hold, that groups hold, that then provide some kind of, I would say, connection between, it really kind of highlights the juxtaposition between discourse and materiality. And so by paying attention to the everyday, I think it already refuses these hardline positions. What Ravinder said about the far right being already here was really resonant with me, because one of the things that draws me to the quotidian, to kind of really spending so much time with practice, with something as very simple as a party and the factors that come together in throwing that party, is the possibility. And in the everyday, that possibility, that potentiality is never guaranteed. It's not guaranteed as progressive or oppressive, but there's always that possibility. And I find something inspirational in that. And part of my kind of sociological lens is to examine how those possibilities are realized in the different settings that they take up. So for me, in that space of the everyday is making sense of how the far right is already here, but also liberation is already here. And in that, I'm encouraged. But then what happens on the internet? Because I don't think it means we don't study the internet. I think the internet provides really helpful, and I don't think I study the internet, but I do study popular culture. And so that necessarily means paying attention to the things that happen on the internet, to the ways that people articulate their positions, to the ways that such fine binaries are drawn through discursive practice. And yet, one of the things that I'm aware of, that I've been trying to make a lot of sense of for the last few years, is how the internet is really, like, we have come to understand the internet as this kind of progressive utopia, this site where so much can happen. And yet what Melody has already talked about is how, like, the algorithm is always going to kind of show you these white supremacist ideas. And we know this, right? We know this from other scholars as well. So I do want to share this book that I read recently, I think last summer, called The Revolution That Wasn't: How Digital Activism Favors Conservatives. And it's a book by Jen Strady, who is a sociologist. And what she's really looking at is the deep offline organizing that shapes the right-wing ecosystem online. And I think that becomes really important to understand that this isn't just something that happens, where it's like, oh, we just happen to keep tweeting a bunch of hashtags and now all these people are anti-vaxxers, right? Just as an example. But instead, there's this mechanism of deep organizing that's happening offline. And then to use the anti-vax position as one, if you read about anti-vaxxers online, you're going to get this wild story of people who you've never met before. And if you talk to the anti-vaxxers in your life, their positions are much more nuanced and complex and confusing. And that then kind of challenges me to be both more compassionate, critical, and empathetic to those positions, and then to find those moments where we might be able to shift it, which isn't everybody's work to do, because I do think that, I mean, I wouldn't want to talk to a bunch of people who hold deeply white supremacist and transphobic views. That could be too much for me. But in that space, in that kind of gap between the discourse where we talk about the far right, but then what happens if we think that it's already here, if we understand that we're living in this moment of extremes in the moment. I think something about the everyday opens up space for us to not only encounter that more critically, but also to find space to make the adjustments to return to that center that we maybe claim to be seeking. Because I mean, I think a deep analysis shows that the center is already pretty radically right in the moment we're living in.
And I just was gonna, I wanted to share a sort of, I don't know, maybe a story, but an example of the ways in which this sort of everyday can also function completely offline, and can actually function to both recruit into these groups, but also to normalize them, and in ways that we don't really track. And then also I noticed that a question just popped up into the Q&A about Cold War politics, and this narrative actually feeds right into these Cold War politics. So as I noted, you know, a lot of these groups, particularly groups that are particularly interested in gun cultures, use the Spartans as a primary mode of iconography, et cetera. So my daughter is a high schooler, and I work in part as an announcer for high school sports events. And so one day I went onto the high school campus and I saw flying on a couple of trucks, one flag. One truck had a flag for a group known as the 3 Percenters, which is a sort of extremist militia movement group in the US. And the other flag was one of these Spartan flags. It said Molon Labe, and it had a Spartan helmet inside of a shield, and then it had a Crusader cross at the bottom. Right, so it's a very sort of specific set of images. And I took a picture of it because I was like, great, like this stuff is coming right home to roost in my little town at the high school campus. And I posted it on my Facebook page, and I said, yay, yay, when my research comes, you know, into my everyday life. And then I get a text message from a friend of mine who said, oh yeah, they're flying that flag on the football field before games, at home games. And so I was like, well, great, now it can't just be a sort of fly-by-night thing that I saw, but I'm going to have to contact the school and let them know what's going on. And so I did this, and they stopped using it. But it recalled an incident that also happened when my stepson, who is now in college, a junior in college, when he was in high school, in 11th or 12th grade, he had the football coach, the former football coach, as his AP World History teacher. And as part of that course, I came home one day and I saw him watching a video clip of the movie The 300, which is based on a graphic novel about a sort of ahistorical rendering of the Battle of Thermopylae between the ancient Spartans and their allies and Xerxes and the Persians back in 479 BCE. And I said, why are you watching this? And he said, I'm watching this because we're supposed to watch this clip and then we're supposed to answer this question for my class, which is, what can the film The 300 tell us about the Persian military back in, the 5th century BCE? And of course, the answer is nothing. In fact, what it actually does feed you is a bunch of really bad orientalizing East-West sort of Cold War politics tropes that actually build on Islamophobia and all these sorts of things. And so here's these two contexts in which the everyday world is sort of colliding to normalize and to actually engender young men who are sort of in this masculinizing sport of football to embrace this iconography, to embrace these the ideas that are sort of embedded into it. And then if they start searching around for it on the internet, or they start watching YouTube clips and things, it's going to bring them right into the sort of extremist gun culture. And a lot of them, because where we live, they're also hunters, and so they already are part of a sort of, pseudo gun culture. So this is a sort of place where this everyday collides then with this sort of world of the East-West Islamophobia that actually builds out of the Cold War rhetoric of Western civilization and the sort of anti-Russian rhetoric of the Cold War, because Russia is the original East in the Western civilization narrative. And the sort of mapping of that onto orientalizing tropes from the 19th century is also part of that discourse. So I'll go ahead and wrap that up, but I wanted to sort of cover that question.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah, I have a question next for Ravinda and Rebecca as well. I mean, it strikes me that when we think of transnational dimensions of the far right or hate and so on, instinctively our mind goes towards sort of flows, right? Flows of resources and repertoires, the sharing of symbols and tropes, a bit like how memes are spread on the internet with sort of creative adaptation. But sticking with the internet metaphor, I think we should also, of course, attend to the underlying architectures, right? It's not just about flows, it's about sort of codified structures that predispose people around the world to think of human diversity in specific ways. So one way in which far right, or indeed most identity-based movements are transnationally connected, is quite unconscious and intangible. It's epistemological. It's about how the modern world has naturalized categories like race and so on. Yeah. So I wonder if Ravinda and Rebecca have thoughts on this. I mean, Ravinda, you've written about how Hindu cultural nationalism works in tandem, in a paradoxical way, perhaps, with market liberalization and economic globalization. Rebecca, you've described race as a technology or doctrine of population management that institutionalizes ethnic prejudice, oppression, and inequality, unquote. And so we're working with even just ways of thinking and these institutionalized and normalized structures that aside from sort of flows of obvious hate rhetoric or symbols and so on, seem to trap us in certain ways of thinking, don't they?
So can I respond? Okay, thank you very much. And I will try and club that with a very interesting question Girish has put in the chat as well, because it is related. So I think I'll just go back to the notion that I was trying to push, that we need to think about transnational once again in the light of the ways in which the nation states are being transformed and rearranged in this new world order. And what I mean by that is that it's a very particular kind of, because transnationalism that we are all familiar with, it was a world of flows, connections, movements. But at some point, we forgot that, there are a lot of stops, barriers, ebbs. It was almost like, theoretically speaking, in 1990s, people were, there was a certain kind of euphoria that you just sort of overlooked it, and this is how our world was being framed. And what I mean by that is that, yes, some things are flowing, but not everything is flowing. And that I think this is the point that you're trying to make. And we need to pay attention to what is allowed to flow and what isn't. And this is where I would say the paradox that I'm trying to bring back again and again is that there is a certain kind of demarcation, a territory making that has taken place, where very, very unexpected kind of things take place, right? And I think this is where I would try to bridge it with the question that Girish is posing, where he's asking that how has religion, that is evangelical Christianity and Hinduism, played an important role in the work of the far-right ultra-nationalists. And this is very interesting because, as you know, there is Hindu hyper-nationalist movement, which is on the rise. And on the other hand, I think other speakers have already noted the American condition and the long history of the far right movements, etc. And what is interesting is that there is actually an interaction between these movements, or for that matter, the European right wing, which is taking place. And most of us who know these different histories are, of course, surprised. Why? Because there is a fundamental tension beneath that. Because in India, for example, everyone knows that the division between religions as such, between Indic and non-Indic religions, which basically means that Christianity and Islam are seen as foreign, like intruders, the ones which do not belong. And every day in and day out, terms like rise back converts, which is an abusive form of address for Christians, like they are inherently seen as converts, right? Or attacks on Christian churches, or for that matter, last year on 25th of December, Missionaries of Charity was shut down. I mean, it could have been closed on any other day. I mean, the foreign, like donations to Missionaries of Charity, which is Mother Teresa's charity, right? So it was taken as an affront that just on the Christmas day, it was shut down. And I can go on and on about that. In other words, it is inherently in a battlefield. But yet, when you look at a different scale, there is a lot of back and forth which is going on between these movements. And this kind of demarcation can only be explained through what I'm trying to propose, that the demarcation of what happens within the nation is not your business. Some things can flow, but I control what precisely it will be. And this is where I would say that we need to pay attention to. For example, capital mobility has been high. Capital can flow. Investments can flow. All nations, including, I mean, Singapore, I realize that you have a Singapore connection. So Singapore, for example, is seen as the model, the authoritarian state, which tightly controls, the political sphere, but at the same time, it allows capital to move in and out, right? Likewise, the state of Christians in India, that is not something that we talk about, but at the same time there are connections between the far right Christian movements and the far right Hindu movement. So what I'm saying is that we need to understand these kind of divergences, demarcations, the kind of internal, external, the ways in which the new transnational space is being constantly rearranged.
Yeah, and I would just then, and I love having Ravinder talk before me, because she sets up like so many ideas that actually dovetail in with the kind of things that I am focused on. But in terms of the quotation that you pulled out and thinking about this sort of long histories and the sort of movement and flow of these things, of these ideas of race and anti-immigration policies and the sort of moving against this like history of flow and of peoples especially. One of the things that I sort of have come to think about is that, once you start shaping an identity, once you start crafting a who belongs, you automatically have to start crafting a who doesn't belong. And once you start crafting that who doesn't belong, you've entered into a racialized space. And those things end up with, if you're in a political order, or once you constitute a political order or a social order or an economic order, you have then created hierarchies. And those hierarchies can only function as long as somebody's on the top and somebody's on the bottom. You have to have a vision of inferior and superior. And then in order to maintain that status quo, you have to be continually reinforcing it through your legal, social, political, economic, and cultural production. So I think that one of the things we want to think about too is when we talk about these far right movements, these are, for me, all embedded, the modern ones, in the creation of the nation state back in the late 18th and early 19th century. I mean, Greece is a great example of this, right? Where it has this ancient history that everybody wants to lay claim to. Britain, Germany, France, the United States, all these Northern European and Anglophone, especially powers, want to lay claim to this deep legacy, but they also want to craft a Greek nation that is separate from the East, right? They want to separate it and make it a European culture that separates it from its African heritage, from its Asian heritage. They want to pull it out of the Ottoman Empire, but then they don't want Greeks to rule it. They give it to Bavarians. And they say, here, we'll have some proper Germans to rule your country for you, because it doesn't really belong to you, it belongs to us. And so when you see these far right movements in Greece, especially, in some ways they are actually, and Balkan nationalism functions the same way. It's reacting against an inter-European colonization of their cultures and their past, but it's also then using the symbols and using the ideas of the very groups that sought to eradicate them. I mean, the Nazis were vicious in Greece and in the Balkans, and yet that's the ideology that they look to craft that in their own exclusive identity. So this is where I think about race and racism and white supremacism as sort of having this sway in a lot of these movements, is because they're inherently about crafting an identity. They're inherently about crafting exclusions and ownership over a cultural heritage or a past that has been, they view it as being stolen, but they're going to then use the mechanisms of those who took it from them in some ways to then reinforce their own identities. So it's super complicated. It is about the transflow back and forth, but also about controlling who does and who doesn't control it. But often, at least in the Greek context, it's happening from a position of people who feel like they've been excluded themselves from their own past and from control of their own identity and culture. So, and then in terms of I will just say one thing on Garish's question, which I think forms out, is that the evangelical Christians, of course, conceptualize America, which lays claim to this Greek culture and this Roman culture, as an inherently white Christian world. And in the far right movements in Greece, it's the ultra-conservative Orthodox church that is fueling this. And that's also another connection with Russia, which shares that Orthodox culture, which the rest of Europe doesn't share with them necessarily.
Girish's questions on the role of religion, I think, is of interest to all the panelists. Melody and Anima, do you want to jump in on that as well?
Yeah, sure. If you don't mind, just to come off of Rebecca's point, making note of evangelical culture in the US. Anthea Butler has a book called White Evangelical Racism. It's a great historical account of the way that, evangelical organizations and institutions have, since the founding of the nation, been actively working to normalize white supremacy and male supremacy and traditionalist hierarchical orders. And in a more contemporary context, related to my own work, I see religion and Christianity specifically as affecting the far right in terms of normalizing concepts of conspiracy, and especially far right concepts of conspiracy, as well as simultaneously normalizing traditionalism and authoritarianisms that have been finding very new forms online and attracting young people, that type of thing. In terms of normalizing conspiracy, the way I see it is that the GOP and evangelical super PACs have been working since the 70s and 80s to marry those two, of course, so that in order to be a Christian, you must vote Republican. And that marrying of those concepts via, linkages of huge donations and capital and these huge organizations has very well worked, to the extent that the concepts of evangelical Christianity are massively normalized in mainstream politics. And we kind of saw the breakthrough of that, especially with Sarah Palin's nomination for vice president. She's a young earth creationist, and she totes a biblical literalism that is actually very, very common amongst evangelical Christianity, if not the default. And then, of course, later we saw Pence, who is also a young earth creationist, takes a very literalist biblical approach to issues of submitting to the husband in wife-husband relationships, as well as like extremely oppressive treatment of LGBT people. And so to me, what I'm seeing here is the normalization of these biblical literalisms is actually simultaneously also a normalization of the idea that spiritual warfare exists, and that invisible actors, whether God, Satan, or demons, are having tangible effect in the world. And so these are ideas that are immensely normal for these groups, and they go very hand in hand with conspiratorial notions, anti-Semitic conspiracies such as the globalists or the elite are, these invisible, powerful actors that are pulling the strings in some great battle between good and evil. So in that sense, evangelical Christianity has actually kind of, there's a quote by someone that religion has laid the tracks or laid the groundwork that far-right conspiracies like QAnon are now running off of. Right, when we have mainstream culture that is used to believing in concepts of spiritual warfare and invisible agencies between good and evil, between the globalists or the Jews, or these types of concepts, they're very much already used to thinking in that way because they're thinking of God and Satan and all these other invisible actors acting. And so, of course, nowadays we see this gigantic movement of QAnon and other far-right conspiracies embedded within mainstream GOP politics, and more senators, showing affiliation with those concepts. And simultaneously, of course, I'll try to be brief here, but Christianity has been working to kind of normalize traditionalism and authoritarianism in ways that have kind of always been there, but are finding new manifestations nowadays. And the one that I'm studying right now is the concept of trad wives, which is a traditional wife is what a trad wife is. And there's actually a trad wife influencer culture trend where very young women that are typically, white, Aryan, promote this idea of submitting to the husband and having as many children as possible in order to forward their traditionalist belief system. So literally to produce more human beings that will share their beliefs in this attempt to kind of push Christian nationalism. And so this is being taken up by far-right actors online, whether they express this via kind of like the pagan politics that Rebecca was talking about, or via Christian concepts. We're seeing a lot of Christian concepts married into the kind of contemporary far-right memeing culture. But of course, these concepts of trad wives and trad wife influencers, like they've been around, they've always been kind of part of mainstream Christianity in my mind. I grew up in a town about an hour north of Toronto, and I had a lot of friends that as a child that were in these kind of Christian communities that were raised to believe the same things, just out of the Canadian Reformed tradition, that they should be submitting to the husband and that they should be having as many children as possible in order to forward the Christianity as the dominant influence in our culture. And so to me, you cannot in any way separate the history of Christian nationalism and evangelical culture from the contemporary manifestations of what we are calling the far right, but is actually, as I said earlier, almost more describable as the mainstream far right, right? Because it's always been there. Christian concepts are very mainstream, and they're almost unassuming locations where these politics flourish. yeah, so that's that. There's a lot to be said there about the connection in the US and Canada between religion and Christianity specifically as a white settler ideology and the current manifestation of the far right.
Anima, solve the religion problem for us.
Well, I really appreciate the question that Girish asked about the role of religion in the work of this kind of like ultra-nationalist movements. One of the more interesting findings, well, really interesting for me, I'm sure others will have different takes on it, from my book, was the relationship between Christian nationalism in the US and Christian nationalism in Ghana. So what I found was that Ghanaian immigrants in the US, or this immigrant community anyway, was articulating itself as belonging within the Christian nation that is the United States, and sharing a genealogical heritage with Abraham Lincoln and those founding fathers by virtue of sharing a religion, by virtue of their shared religion of Christianity. So in other words, there was the construction of Christian America, which immigrants who shared this religious position slotted themselves into, and the construction of Ghana as a Christian nation. And these two positions were constructed in such a way as to be supremacist. And what that really kind of called my attention to was the colonial inheritance of Christianity, right? Christianity doesn't come to Ghana as a benign gift. As the people say, the white man came with the Bible and the gun, and they left with the land, or whatever, however the saying goes. But really talking about the violence of the introduction of Christianity into this Ghanaian context. And I just want to be specific here for a moment. And so kind of thinking about this construction of Christianity in the articulation of a Ghanaian national identity, so that it's to be Ghanaian is to be Christian, even though in Ghana, for example, about 30% of the population is Muslim. There are people who practice Hinduism, Buddhism, traditional African religions, no religions, but that's a smaller percentage of the population. That notwithstanding, the dominant idea is that to be a Ghanaian is to be a Christian. And while Muslims are perhaps included in that, they are conditionally included in who gets to be a Ghanaian. So that relationship between Christianity and national identity is one that links the post-colonial nation to the US, for example, which is constructed as a Christian nation, and also links the post-colonial nation to ideas of modernity, which underpin the way that we think about Christianity as well. And so if Christianity is modernity, then the kinds of oppressive, and particularly evangelical Christianity or Pentecostalism, then the kinds of oppressive moves that happen under the guise of Christianity, which include capitalist exploitation, which include these kind of binary notions of gender and sexuality and other forms of social control, are justified as modern acts. And I think that becomes a really important thing to think about when, especially as we're in this moment in which kind of Christianity, in this moment in which religion is disparaged, right? Because spirituality is a source of power for vast numbers of indigenous peoples around the world. And Christianity has been a source of power for through colonialism. So I'm thinking about those three C's: colonialism, Christianity, and commerce, or commerce, Christianity, and civilization, as it was called. So I'm really glad that Melody mentioned Thea Butler's book, because what I love that book a lot. And one of the things that happens is that there's this moment in the 1980s where Billy Graham shows up and then disappears, right? And during that time, Billy Graham and his cohort are on a colonial mission in Africa, right? And so the same kinds of crusades, the same kinds of the level of popularity that these people have in the US is replicated, at least on the African continent, and I can imagine in other places as well. And what that again calls our attention to is the transnationalism of this religion, of evangelical Christianity in particular, so that we again see how those ideas are not exclusive to this particular culture, but not only are exported and then taken up and made our own. Here I'm talking about in the Ghanaian context. So of course, there's the Africanizing of Pentecostalism that we might think about, which then ties different indigenous practices with Christian ideas and then says this is ours. And so I do think it's important to think about those connections and also to think about how they manifest in different indigenous contexts. And with that said, I also think it becomes important to think about how different indigenous spiritual practices are mobilized to challenge these kinds of neo-colonial and, in fact, colonial expressions of Christian nationalism as well. So I don't know, that probably doesn't solve the problem, but I hope it gives us a lot to think about as well.
Definitely. I mean, clarity always helps. The one of the running themes that I'm hearing from all four of you is that you know, it's probably too pat and too convenient to recite that, you know, the standard line we hear from many countries, right? That, oh, hate, the far right is so un-American, intolerance is so un-Indian, and so on. But but when you look at the role of religion and nationalism and so on, another way to look at it, actually, no, some of this intolerance and hate is one logical outcome of things that are deeply embedded in our societies, right? But I want to emphasize that it's one logical outcome. We're not talking about any deterministic relationship between religion and nationalism on the one hand, and exclusionary, hateful ideas on the other, right? And maybe I'm seeing too many silver linings, but I think I heard Anima mention that one of the benefits of looking at the everyday is that you also see signs of hope. It's not all signs of despair, right? And I want to, you know, before we get, we cause a mass exodus from places of worship among our attendees and everyone giving up on religion. You know, are there signs of you know, within the US, within Canada, Ghana, India, of religious communities trying to reclaim, you know, more progressive, more human rights oriented, more inclusive ways of interpreting their faith? Ravinda, do you want to go first?
I mean, that's a very good question. And I think I almost also say that, you know, we sort of look for hope always. I mean, also in research, I mean, I think if I was to look for hope, then I would say that, you know, religion per se doesn't do anything. I mean, you know, many of the religious traditions that we are talking about, they were, you know, anti-establishment or anti, you know, like contesting power dynamics, right? I mean, just continue unfolding the histories of religions, or before they became institutionalized religions, this is what they were. So in other words, that there is actually, it is not within that structure, like it is perfectly possible to also make a change, a very, very profound change if one wants to do that. So to think of it as a raw material, as a resource which can be put to work in a different way. And I think because it has become just too easy to say that this is religion's, you know, that this is the fault of religion or religious beliefs or something like that. Because of course we know that this is not how it works. So the point would be that, I mean, I can only speak about India because that's my ground that I work in. And what we can see is that these contestations are actually happening in surprising ways in places that we had not expected. I mean, I think the most, the specific example that I can give to you is, I don't know if you know that there has been this massive anti-farm law protest in India. And first of all, those protests, they were not expected at all, because the state is seen as so mighty and so powerful and all-encompassing that to imagine that there would be a mass protest which would go on for nearly a year, that was almost unimaginable. But more fundamentally, something else was taking place, within this framework, namely that a kind of secular, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, like across religions, a new kind of solidarity, not just religion, but also cross-caste solidarity, which began emerging. And one example is the revival of some of the farmers or, unions or the workers' movements, which had been kind of dampened, during the capitalist rollover, the reforms, economic reforms. And for instance, one of the movements, it incorporates the slogans that it goes, takes away the slogans of, it's not just workers or farmers long live, but also recalling Har Har Mahadev, which is seen as a Hindu slogan, or Allahu Akbar, a Muslim reply to it, right? So integrating that. What I'm saying is, none of this had been foreseen. That none of this, it is like material economic interest on one hand, and the ways in which it sets in motion a certain kind of churning, which has profound social impact, and the religious caste across solidarity. And there's one more solidarity I must mention, which is gender solidarity here. That many people were surprised to see men at the protest movement cooking food, because cooking food, home and hearth, is seen as women's business. And all of a sudden, women are at the protest too. So it somehow just shook up so many of those assumptions. So what I'm saying is that, even like we cannot engineer everything, but keep your eyes open. And surprisingly, that shaking up, the churning will come from the most unexpected quarters.
I guess the fact that we cannot engineer everything is extremely reassuring, right? Because that's precisely what fascists want to do. They want to engineer everything. And I think that the kind of the surprise that you express is, is wonderful, and it I guess suggests that we remain, even in societies that are so heavily indoctrinated to think of themselves in only in terms of only one identity, that we are, in the words of Amartya Sen, diversely different, and people won't get rid of that easily, right? Unfortunately, far-right groups and other fascists have been extremely too successful in selling the #1 piece of fake news that is causing havoc around the world, the idea that we only are made up of a single identity, right? But too many people just don't buy it, right? When push comes to shove, right? They remember that we are also women, we are also farmers, and so on, and that perhaps that's what will stop us from going to hell. But okay, so I'm not going to ask everyone to identify sources of hope, because our commercial break is over. We've got enough hope. Let's return to despair, right? I want to return to a point again that Anima made that I'd like any of you to respond to. The fact that these divisions between progressives and the far right and is far too neat, right? I mean, Anima mentions in her in Anima's book that let me find that quote. A culture of resistance to a colonial narrative about Africa and Africans. Well, it can be anti-colonial, but it isn't always progressive, right? So these kinds of contradictions really intrigue me, because so often we think in national terms, but when we expand our scope and look at things globally, it becomes far more complex and far more messy. And I think some of what has been said about Greece, it brings to mind some of the debates happening in this part of the world, right? Where I think to many mainland Chinese, they are engaged in this anti-imperial, anti-Western colonial struggle, which of course another side of it is extremely unprogressive, extremely worrying for human rights and so on. So there are these, unfortunately, these struggles don't often align in any kind of neat way, right? And there are these contradictions in every society. Does anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, actually, as I was just thinking about it because so there was an internet incident a couple of years ago in which a British member of my discipline made a comment to so there are a number of individuals who are anti-Arab and anti-Black who are from the Near East who lay claim to Greek identity, which they, as people who are from regions that have a very deep past connected to the Greeks, this is a totally valid identity, but they often use it to wield against Black Africans or against their Arab neighbors. But in the context of a conversation, a British classicist said, well, you're not Greek, Greece is this. And it was this tension that you just noted about, well, here's someone who's actually grown up in a world that actually is surrounded by the remnants of this culture that they feel they are participants of. But they're actually part of a sort of far-right neo-fascist discourse, whereas this progressive British woman who has made a career out of Greece as a European identity come into conflict, right? But someone who identifies as progressive and who is part of a colonialist discourse. And so, of course, the pushback was you're attempting to push me out of an identity using your whiteness, and you're a colonizer, and it gets really super complicated when you have these worlds, these identities that, it's not even that identities are singular, it's that identities are multivalent in all cases. Calling someone Greek, ancient Greek, is in fact to use the Roman colonizers' term, right? To recognize that most Greeks in their everyday lives didn't go around saying, I'm a Greek. They went around saying, I'm an Athenian, or I'm a Macedonian, or I'm Cyrenian, or I'm Alexandrian, or I'm Halicarnassian. And this is, we've already covered 3 continents. And that's their primary identities. So you have these sort of real little complications when we try to fit these identities into our modern discourses of colonialism and decolonialization. And when we attempt also to use the past to negotiate the present, but also when we use the present to try and reconstruct the past, where you're going to have people who are identifying on the left and the far left and the far right, or anywhere in the spectrum in their modern political commitments, running into each other because they're both trying to do make the same move, but they're trying to use the same content, but they're trying to use it to build very different identities and to promote very different ideologies. But what happens when the material can be used and those paths can be used for both? Then you have a collision. And you have valid arguments across the spectrum of what this past looked like, but also I hate saying that people are misappropriating the past, because it's all appropriation of the past, of these shared pasts. And they don't have the same political commitments as we want them to have. And so, of course, you're going to have absolute tension between these, and sometimes you have uncomfortable overlaps in your conversations with people you would like to not overlap with, as it were.
Picking up on your the word you use, uncomfortable, that brings us to a question from Catherine Bluen, who asks, how do you protect yourself from the psychological and other consequences of studying the uncomfortable topics and groups that you research? Who would like to? Melody, you've been in the mix. I understand. Have you been immersed in the commotion that's happening in your city right now?
Yeah,
How do you protect yourself psychologically and physically?
I mean, I think that it's actually a question that I've been getting since I started this research, and it does change through time, right? It does wear you down. You know, there are points where you're sitting around discussing politics with friends, and you just want to throw up your hands and be like, I hate it. I can't do it anymore. I think that I mean, what we would like is for grad students and others in my position to have proper coverage for therapy, which we're working on. But I think as well, there is an element of privilege that comes into play. I was raised in a small Christian white community in Canada, and these ideas are very familiar to me. They don't hit me in the same way as they would someone that is not you know, a white Canadian. And so I think that it is really important for people that do have privilege to take up the particularly harmful work of engaging with these concepts of white supremacy, and also engaging with the kind of everyday commentary that you see happening online. I used to study more extreme spaces like 4chan, and it's definitely very harrowing, and I don't think there is a single answer for dealing with those things, except to understand your work as a scholar as doing more than just producing scholarly literature. I think that's the thing that keeps me going, is that, you know, that we are here, I'm in these spaces, listening to trad wives talk about submitting to their husbands and having lots of kids. I am doing this so that we can produce literature that has insights about how to intervene and resist, and to support actual networks of resistance as well, as opposed to just providing scholarly content. So to me, that's a motivation that is very helpful. But so also are VPNs and scholarly networks that support you in your work. So, yeah, that kind of leads into the second question as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I wonder if Anima could pick up the second half of Catherine's question. Do you have any particular suggestions of everyday ways forward for academics, teachers, students, and everyone else who might be watching this and might be willing to disrupt the normalization of these far-right movements? But the reason why I wanted you to ask this is because, you know, I got the sense dipping into your book that, you know, you're having conversations with your African informants, some of whom you don't agree with, obviously, because of these contradictions that you mentioned, right? And I mean, you know, clearly one challenge for teachers as well as, you know, classmates and anyone in society is to protect yourself and those you care about from extreme discourse. But at the same time, you also want to not be too judgy, right? You don't want to push away those with views that, you know, privately you disagree with. How do you walk that line and create a inclusive dialogue, even if it's just among two people, where there is genuine exchange and, you know, and sort of sincerity and good faith?
Yeah, thanks for expanding on that question in that way. It really, I think, leads back to your earlier question about hope. So I just want to begin there. I know that in my own development as a scholar and as a public intellectual, one of the foundational texts that I keep returning to is Jackie Alexander's Pedagogies of the Sacred. And this is in her book, Pedagogies of Crossing. And in that chapter, she's really kind of opening us up to think more expansively about what is sacred and how our bodies kind of come into these different kinds of conversations and spaces how we deal with noxious positions, and at the same time find space for moving forward. One of the things that I think is really helpful in that kind of thinking is that there can be differences without hierarchies. This is also something that Audre Lorde teaches us, right? Like that we can work with and across difference. It's not inherently that I'm different from you and therefore I'm better than you or you're better than me, but there is space and possibility to work towards a shape of liberation that we can all attain. And so I think that's an ethos more than it is anything else. That I don't know how much one might call it a an everyday suggestion in that sense, right? But it's part of a practice that I have had to learn to cultivate. I started by studying whiteness, and that is a difficult thing to study as a queer African immigrant in the US. So already that process encouraged me to, or I think developed my sense of psychological protection while also being able to pursue these questions and do the work. But at the same time, I think that being in community is a very grounding space to return to, especially when, because being in community doesn't mean being in a space where everyone thinks what you think and agrees with what you do. And, but when you're in that kind of community, it's not necessarily helpful because then there's no space to understand why are these people thinking that, what are the material realities that are shaping that, how do we get into conversation. But really being in that kind of community space in which difference is accommodated and worked with then teaches me how to go out and have these other kinds of conversations that can challenge positions that I don't necessarily agree with. But I've also learned not to judge. I mean, of course, everybody judges, but what I mean is I've learned to kind of take my own judgments with a grain of salt as well. So I think that's part of that practice. But I find myself returning to pedagogies of the sacred as a way of being able to navigate these kind of tense spaces. And there is another source that I wanted to share on that question of hope and religion, which returns us to indigenous religious practice, and that's Ana Maureen Laura's Queer Freedom, Black Sovereignty, which is about the Dominican Republic. It's an anthropological text, and what she's looking at is the solidarities built between African descended people and indigenous peoples in the DR that are challenging these kind of state interventions through spirituality. And it's really quite expansive and open and encourages us to once again view the world in a different sort of way. And these are not pristine utopic spaces. I think it's really important to kind of highlight that, but they are spaces that challenge kind of distinction between an other world and this world, between what is progressive and what is regressive, tradition and modernity, and all of these sorts of things, and actually invite us to deal with that messiness in what I think can be much more generative ways. And so these are kind of spaces that I turn to help not only that kind of psychological protection, but also kind of ways of really being in the tension of the far right that is now and being able to see the possibility as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Girish, you have a question. Can I invite you to turn on your camera and ask it in person?
Yes, please. Thanks a lot, Cherian. I just want to say I've really been enjoying the conversation so far, and I think it's a really, truly important one. And the breadth and the depth of this conversation has really been very, very enriching to me. And Cherian, you've been a great chair. I just have been amazed at how you've been coming back with such amazing questions. So this is just my gratitude to you all. But my question is really about some of the things that you've touched on with regards to, what has changed and what hasn't changed, because, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. is like a colonialism is one of the things that is kind of like hovering in the background of this conversation with regards to its the intersection between a colonialism and capitalism, right? And how the formations of these nation states, these post-colonial, settler colonial nation states, whether it's the US, Canada, Ghana, India, all the categories that were received and used came from categories like race, came from Hindu. It's very much a category that that the Brahmins, in conversation with the British colonialists, kind of used to create distinctions, to create exclusions. And now we have this new Hindu nationalist formation in Ghana, the Christian nationalist formation that comes out of evangelical Pentecostal groups in Canada and the US, in Europe. This is an older conversation that has somehow come to almost be renewed. And I guess my question after this long introduction is really about how the politicians have been using the disenfranchisement of ordinary people in ways to then bring these different strands together, and almost in a very pragmatic, capitalistic way. You look at what's happening in the US and Canada and India, in Ghana, you find that the mobilization of people and money and ideas, there are very powerful politicians or just politicians who are actually benefiting from this. Can you speak a bit to that? I mean, because it's not just about far-right people with far-right ideas going out on the streets and saying we want our freedom, but there are actually people who are not on the streets, but who are benefiting from those people on the streets. That's my question.
Can I tie that in with a question, a comment from Ray Singh, who asks if academics are partly to blame for what Girish calls the disenfranchisement of large numbers of people in our societies, and maybe more broadly, right? Elites, cultural elites, intellectual elites, media elites, and so on, but certainly academic elites too. Is that part of the problem? And of course, the point that Girish mentioned, that in response, you have, for want of a better word, populists who are picking up the slack. This seems to be one of the cross-cutting international trends that we've seen over the last 5-10 years. Let me turn to Ravinder on that, because although earlier you kind of almost apologetically saying, I only know India, but come on, India is the it's the second largest country in the world and the largest democracy in the world. The place, India is ground zero for many of the things that we're talking about. So there's absolutely no apologies needed for specializing in India.
No, I think this is a great question. So therefore I raise my hand, because this is something I'm trying to grapple with, because, those of us who have been studying this topic over many years, I think I've been very surprised that how come there is a certain kind of amnesia? Because the very conditions which we are told are at the heart of producing the populist, far-right, etc., movements, they were literally created by, a set of, actors, processes, etc., which precisely have turned into the saviors, the benefactors. What I'm trying to say is this whole question about the globalists or the elite, the people who, go to Davos, etc. I mean, they are at once the people who have produced the conditions, but they are also benefiting from it. So I think one potential explanation for this is that the ways in which we came to conceive the late 20th century world, the language, the terminology, which was, the language of globalization, of cosmopolitanism, of, as I said before, of flows. And that was actually a very euphoric moment, not just in terms of history writing, end of history, Francis Fukuyama, but also very strangely within the whole task of theory making within humanities and social sciences. What I'm trying to say is that there was this whole push to look at the world in terms of, interconnections, flows, etc. And the term globalization told us less, it hit more, but it did not reveal the true processes at work. What I mean to say is that globalization literally is, everyone knows the ABCD, you, I'm sure, teach in the classrooms, that this is, we are speaking about movements, right? Certain kind of mobilities. And it was supposed to create a better world, you know, the free market, etc. But basically what it never, the word which should have been used but was never used was capitalism. Because literally globalization is a free market plus multiculturalism. We came to celebrate not just the fact that people, you know, capital is moving around, but innovation is taking place. But we also sort of live in this multicultural cosmopolitan world where we eat every different things or etc. in a very trivial, interesting ways also. So what I'm saying is that imagine now, you know, a thought experiment for you, that if all along in 1990s, we had not used the term globalization, but we actually said that this is capitalist world being shaped up popularly, even though scholars and policymakers, they were saying that, right? What if the backlash would have been against capitalism? So when we speak about the people left behind, you know, in Michigan, for instance, or when the car industries you know, collapsed, or when, you know, like all these things, when industry has moved out and blue collar workers are left, and then we are told that they are the ones who are pushing, you know, these kind of processes. I don't agree with that. I think we need to look at the conceit which is taking place, you know, the kind of language which continues to hide the world historical processes. And it's not, and you're so right, by the way, it's not just India or US. I mean, I live in Europe. It is literally the same story over here. The very people who created the, I mean, the best example is Trump. Literally the man, I mean, what kind of amnesia must have happened where literally people have, they took a billionaire, you know, even if a shoddy, fragile billionaire, you know, to be the person who is looking after the interests of the people left behind by globalization, for God's sake. So which basically, you know, it's a question about, it's about people and politics. It's a volume, by the way, we are working on, and hopefully in a few months, it should be out, because I think a lot of this theory making on populism is way off the mark.
I'm going to treat that, Ramita, as your closing remarks. I think, I mean, in a way, you pose the question and also answer it. It's not amnesia, right? It's deliberate ideological you know, construction by elites to shift the target away from capitalism towards something else, right? But can I ask, since we're running out of time, unfortunately, I could go on, but I think other people have better things to do, right? Not me. But can I ask the other three panelists to give us some wrap-up comments of 1 or 2 minutes? For me, the key words that have come out from this, among many, are normalization, mainstreaming. Let's not think of the far right as something far out there. We're in the midst of it, and we are partly to blame as well for the societies that we have created. Shall we go in the same order that we started with, Melody?
Sure, yeah. And when Marinder was talking, I was just thinking more and more about you know, the convoy protests and that have really taken up the identity of a working class movement, despite the fact that, you know, millions of working class people are still going to their jobs. The majority of truckers are still having to work within this system. And meanwhile, there's this kind of astroturfing, $10 million raised for this movement. I saw in the convoy, you know, BMWs and Audis participating, and yet still under the guise of this working class movement. So I think that Ravinder is absolutely right. This has been this kind of this rhetoric that it has been the working class at the head of this surge of populism is entirely off the mark. But what is instead happening is this, and we see this in the truck convoy, this push to the larger voice of populism here is this push to be able to continue consuming within the capitalist model. At the end of the day, that's what the trucker convoy wants, is to have no more mandates so that we can continue within unbridled capitalism, to continue consuming that. And I think what is happening is this is something that obviously is pushed and dominated by the upper class and the capitalist class, and but what that's doing is creating this kind of cultural norm of the desire to consume, and people are being drawn up into that. And so I guess to return to previous points as well, I really enjoyed the discussion about needing to take people that get drawn up into these rhetorics seriously, as not just part of, fooled by their working class position, but drawn up in rhetorics and material organizations that always have and will benefit the upper class and the capitalist class. As a whole, this panel has been really great for me in terms of covering all of these bases. It's a great takeaway to see studies of the far right moving towards this understanding of how these far right ideologies are embedded and sown within mainstream systems and institutions, whether it be Christianity as linked to colonialism and as linked to building of capitalist America, towards consumerism itself. And so it's been very encouraging to be a part of this conversation. And I'm looking forward to seeing everything else that that people are publishing right now.
Thank you. Anima?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of share a few takeaways that I got from this conversation, because it's been so incredibly nourishing. And I think that perhaps the biggest one is this kind of reorientation to the discussion of the far right as not afar, but here, because that immediately changes the frame of analysis for how we engage these things. And so I'm really thinking seriously about that as I continue in my own work. The second thing is the importance of a clarity of terms. There's this way in which we use these terms that obscure more than they explain. And so what happens if we're talking about colonialism rather than neoliberalism or globalism or whatever it is, right? What happens if we're talking about capitalism? What I think returning to these terms that have historically allowed us to make these conditions more clearly offers us, once again, sharper analytical tools for dealing with the problem. And finally is the question of religion and how different kinds of religious fundamentalisms continue to encourage these transnational solidarities that ultimately harm us. As someone who really kind of takes seriously the reality that spirituality has been a source of power for indigenous peoples, I'm now asking, to what extent can these kinds of indigenous spiritualities also be engaged in transnational solidarities as well? So that's a thought that emerges for me coming out of this, but this has been such a brilliant conversation. Thank you, Garish. Thank you, Sherian. Thank you, all the panelists. I've learned so much.
And finally, to the Oracle at Delphi, Rebecca.
Again, I did it again, I muted. So I actually want to end with a quotation from my favorite anthropologist and classicist, Maurizio Bettini, who in 2016 republished an essay that he wrote called Against Roots, which I think actually sort of encapsulates a lot of the dynamics that we have been talking about on this panel, and I think is informative. He says, and he wrote this actually originally in response to the immigration crisis in Italy and the sort of discourse, anti-immigrant discourse that emerged out of the mass movements of peoples into Italy from Africa. So he says, if this is how things stand, it is possible that the past and tradition are returning to a central place in our attention, because there, and in some cases by now only there, exists the final defense of difference. If the airports of Rome and Paris are indistinguishable, if the same cars pass through the same roads, if the same cell phone ringtones jingle on the street, where is the difference anymore between the two cities? Where is the difference between us and them? In the past, it was the Church of Notre Dame that provides us with a different identity. It was the water of the Po River. It was the uncountable mythologized locations sprinkled throughout the land. It was the traditional religious practices, the languages, the dialects of our fathers, the recipes of our grandmothers. The past is once again shaping itself, and rather dangerously, I should clarify straight away, as the place of group identity. We live sunk in a real anthropology of homogenization and create from it an imaginary anthropology of difference. So I thought that captured together a lot of the things that I've heard being discussed on this panel. He actually goes on to talk about the sort of modes of capitalism that inform globalization. And that actually hide from us our actual, what could be solidarity in the name of keeping us apart and emphasizing these differences. And so I've been very grateful to be included in such a brilliant group of people to have this conversation. I think that's actually the one thing that truly helps all of us with the psychological impact of these types of studies, is that we are doing them together in collaboration and in communities. And so that to me is the thing that keeps us going. And Garish did just ask for a link to the book. It's only in Italian, so I can get the link for you, but you have to be able to read Italian. I happen to have an in-home translator who is fluent in Italian, so I don't have to worry about that. I'll just
send us the quote that you just read. It was beautiful.
Okay, I will put it into the chat here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, you've all been so generous, not only with your thoughts, but also your citations and favorite authors and so on. And I'm glad Girish is going to make that available to us later. Speaking of the past, 2 hours ago, we thought, 2 hours and 5 minutes ago, we thought this would end in 2 hours. I'm sorry, Girish, to have stolen 5 minutes from you. It's simply because I just could not stop. I did not want to stop these speakers. You've put together a great panel, and thank you for allowing me to be part of them. Back to you, Girish.
Thank you so much, Acharya. I just want to say very quickly, this has been an amazing panel. It's going to be distributed on 2 websites, Human Stories and Everyday Orientalism. It's going to be, I believe, a huge educational resource. But just this conversation and being here has taught me so much. And all of you have been amazing contributors, including our chair, Acharya and George, to this conversation. So I just want to say, go in peace, go in good health. And thank you very much for your help, for your solidarity, for the conversation. We will see each other again, hopefully very, very soon in another platform. Thank you again. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.